2018, probably one of the best years for video games of all time. Red Dead Redemption 2, by many to be considered one of the best games of all time, the Game of the Year winner God of War, Insomniac's Spider-Man, Monster Hunter World, Smash Bros. Ultimate, Kingdom Come Deliverance, Hitman 2, Sea of Thieves, A Way Out, Just Cause 4, Shadow of the Colossus remake, Far Cry 5... Let's see, am I forgetting one? Oh yeah, and Assassin's Creed. The name Assassin's Creed Odyssey is one that comes with a lot of baggage for the Assassin's Creed community. I used to believe Unity was the most controversial AC game when it came out by how split opinions on it from the community initially were, but man, that is nothing compared to Odyssey. It's hard to find someone who doesn't have an extreme opinion of this game, be it positive or negative, especially in the age of the internet, where it feels like something is either the best or worst thing ever with no room for nuance in between. And it's no mystery why this game is so divisive. It's fundamentally very different from many of the things people had associated with Assassin's Creed up until that point. For a long time, Assassin's Creed had a very specific identity. An open-world action-adventure series built around stealth, parkour, combat, and a narrative involving an age-old conflict between the Assassin's Creed and the Knights Templar. After the disastrous launch of Unity and the underwhelming performance of Ubisoft Quebec's previous title, Assassin's Creed Syndicate, the series went in a different direction, hoping to give Assassin's Creed a refresh and renew players' interests in a series that to some had gotten stale. That's when we got Assassin's Creed Origins. Not only did it bring us to a setting that had been long requested for the franchise to visit, but it also explored the origin story of the Assassin's Creed while changing the overall structure and formula of the series we had become so accustomed to. A massive new open world injected with RPG mechanics like a leveling system, weapon and gear rarities, plenty of side content, not to mention they basically started over when it came to gameplay to create something completely new. And by nearly all accounts, this attempt at a refresh was mostly successful. Origins sold well, was reviewed well, and to this day is still looked back on with fond eyes by many. Although it seems Ubisoft was already confident this new direction for Assassin's Creed would pan out well, because they started development at Ubisoft Quebec on the next step in this new-look Assassin's Creed in 2015, just after Quebec had wrapped up their work on Syndicate, which would bring us a massive game only a year after Origins, as best described by the game's producer.
Odyssey is the second step in the transformation of Assassin's Creed into a full-blown RPG.
My history with Assassin's Creed Odyssey is a turbulent one. You could say it's been quite the Odyssey itself. Why'd I write that? That's such a bad joke. Okay, anyway. Those who have watched me for a long time are probably aware of my journey with this game. In fact, some of my early videos on Odyssey are where a lot of my initial audience came from. And to say I strongly disliked this game might have been putting it mildly. When I first played this game in the fall of 2018, it came as a shock. I couldn't believe how different it was from the Assassin's Creed that I had fallen in love with. And when you love something like that for a while, for it to be so abruptly changed into something completely different from what you were used to, yeah, you bet it comes as a massive shock. That's not to say I had an absolutely miserable time in that first playthrough 6 years ago. There were still parts of the experience I enjoyed, but my overall takeaway from it when I had first played it was, this isn't my Assassin's Creed. It was missing a lot of what I personally loved and valued in the series, and so it was very hard for me to just enjoy the game for what it was. When I made this YouTube channel a year later, it was an outlet for me to express a lot of my frustrations with the game and the overall direction the series was heading in. However, as time passed and I briefly revisited the game for videos and spoke with people in my comments who did really like the game, my stance on Odyssey softened a little bit as I began to understand what people loved about it and looked back on it through a different lens with a more open mind. I don't want to be too harsh on my younger self. He was new to YouTube and doing the best he could, but that's what I think I was, close-minded. I held on very strongly to the idea that this isn't my Assassin's Creed and refused to acknowledge a lot of the game's positives. So this has been an experience I've been eagerly awaiting for a while. To go back to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, replay the game in full, as it's been several years since I've done so, and give it the fair chance I should have initially, instead of just rejecting it and not giving it a chance because it wasn't what I personally wanted. Going back now with a more open mind, I got to see if I would actually enjoy my time with it or not, and so I could share that experience with you guys. Make no mistake, I have been and will always be a champion of the old formula of Assassin's Creed. Those games are what got me to love this series and kept me hooked on it for so long, to the point where I'd basically make a career out of talking about and playing them. I mean, Assassin's Creed is on my mind almost every hour of every day. It's a special kind of joy and torture. And believe me, there are times where I think, why couldn't I be a super fan of a better series? All this to say though, while I will always prefer the Assassin's Creed of old to the RPGs, I still want to keep an open mind and try to enjoy these games for what they are. It's not that I dislike the RPG genre either. I love RPGs. The Witcher 3 is my favorite video game of all time, and Odyssey clearly takes a lot of inspiration from it. It was just never the kind of experience or genre I wanted out of Assassin's Creed. It's not what I play Assassin's Creed for. And if you prefer the RPGs in Assassin's Creed, that's totally fine. But I'm just here to give my own personal opinion after replaying Odyssey 6 years later, the things I like about it, the things I don't. There's an ample amount of both, so I'm going to express my feelings about the game the best I can. This game is also probably the most relevant it's been since its release, as the same team that made Odyssey launches the game they've been working on since in February of next year, assuming it doesn't get delayed again. And I'm curious to see when Shadows launches how it differs from Odyssey, and how the reception and feedback to that game may have impacted Ubisoft Quebec's choices and direction when developing Shadows. So we're probably in for a long ride, as I have so much to say. At this moment, I don't even know how long this will be, but I hope you'll join me through this adventure of Assassin's Creed Odyssey 6 years later. It's pretty crazy to realize it's already been 6 years since Odyssey released. It came out only a year after Origins, which looking back is insane. To think that we got two massive games in Origins and Odyssey in back-to-back years? It felt normal at the time because AC had almost always been an annual franchise for the most part up until that point, but having two 50 to 100 hour RPG experiences in back-to-back years is absurd. You're not seeing that happen in other big AAA game series. There are other annual release game series out there, obviously, like Call of Duty, but that's hardly comparable to having these massive RPG open world games in back-to-back years. And Ubisoft has even publicly said now that they don't need to release big RPGs so frequently, and that they want to space them out a bit more, which is why it's been 4 years since the last RPG released, Valhalla. The reason this was possible back in 2018 though, was because while Ubisoft Montreal had been developing Origins since 2013, after that team launched Black Flag, alongside it, Ubisoft Quebec was making Odyssey after they launched Syndicate in 2015. So Odyssey had about a solid 3 years of development, which for a game of this size really isn't a whole lot, but Assassin's Creed as a series has a history of barely giving their development teams any time to make games. I'm sure Ubisoft Sofia would have killed to have those 3 years of development time instead of the mere 8 months they got for Assassin's Creed Rogue. Not to mention, this was only Ubisoft Quebec's second Assassin's Creed game. Their first was Syndicate, as they became the first Ubisoft studio outside of Montreal to develop a mainline entry for the series. Before that, they made the Tyranny of Washington expansion for AC3 and Freedom Cry for Black Flag. And while with Syndicate, they were tasked with building off the foundation of Unity, with Odyssey, they were now meant to do that with Origins. Where Origins dipped its toes into the RPG waters, Odyssey dove off of a cliff while doing a backflip into the deep end. Whether that was the right next step and direction to go in is a matter of opinion, but Odyssey certainly pushed the RPG envelope further, for better or worse. It was the first game in the series to introduce choice, for dialogue options and actions that could have serious ramifications and impact on an ever-branching story. A trademark of many big RPGs that Origins elected not to go for, but Odyssey did. The game placed even more of a heavy emphasis on loot and gear, encouraging the player to create builds and micromanage their different stats. The leveling system was inflated, whereas in Origins, the level cap for the main game was level 40, which was then expanded to level 55 through the 2 expansions. For Odyssey, the level cap is 99. Origins was a big game, the biggest in the series up until that point. An average playthrough would take somewhere from 30 hours if you were focusing on main objectives, to 85 if you strove for 100% completion. Odyssey's main story is about 45 hours, while striving for 100% completion would take you into the realm of another 100 hours on top of that, bringing it close to a 150-hour run to 100% the game. About 100 hours of possible side content. That is insane. And in order to keep my mental sanity, I did not strive for 100% completion in my playthrough, but I did want to experience a vast majority of the side content the game had to offer, which brought me well into the realm of 100 hours. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, saying that just now makes me wonder if spending 100 hours on this game is really such a good use of the limited time I have on this planet. It was important to me though that I experienced a lot of what the game had to offer, because when I first played Odyssey, I didn't do much side content. I did what was required to be the proper level for the main story and just continued on with that, because I wanted to get through the game as quickly as possible, which I don't feel like is the way the game is meant to be experienced. I mean, if people want to play that way, they should have the freedom to do so, but a game like this, where so much of the experience is in the side content, again, like my favorite game, The Witcher 3, made me want to do a lot of it so I could get the most enjoyment I could out of the game. I'll talk more in depth about side content later, but I want to let you know how and why I chose to experience the game the way I did, because there are a lot of different ways you can play a big RPG like this, where the pace and order in which you complete it is mostly your choice. But before we continue on our Odyssey, I want to take a quick minute to thank this video's sponsor, War Thunder. Most of you probably know what War Thunder is, but in case you don't, it's the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and is now available for free on both PC and consoles. There's over 2,500 ships, planes, tanks, and helicopters from 10 different nations to play with, from 1920s fighter jets and armored cars to modern battle tanks. This game has it all. And with its incredibly well-detailed and crafted vehicles, where each individual component has been made from the engines, fuel tanks, weapons, and crew, War Thunder's combat and vehicle damage is far more sophisticated than simple boxes with hit points. So join the community of over 70 million players on War Thunder today by checking out the link via the description or pinned comment. And for any new or returning players who haven't played in the last 6 months, you'll even get a massive bonus pack, which will get you the Eagle of Valor vehicle decorator, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium for free. This offer is only available for a limited amount of time, so check it out now, and thank you once again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Assassin's Creed Odyssey begins in 480 BC at the Battle of Thermopylae, by far the furthest back in time we've ever gone for the series, as King Leonidas and his few hundred Spartans make their last stand against the overwhelming force of invading Persians. There is some clear inspiration taken from Zack Snyder's The 300 in these scenes, and even though the actual plot of the game takes place 50 years later, during the Peloponnesian War, there is still some relevance to this opening with Leonidas during the Persian Wars. For one, King Leonidas is the grandfather of our protagonist, Alexios or Cassandra, depending on whom you choose, and his spear is a first civilization artifact and our main weapon throughout the game. And in many ways, the Persian Wars set the stage for the Peloponnesian War to come soon after. So while it may seem a bit odd to start the game here, it does carry some relevance with the main plot. Even if Ubisoft Quebec really just wanted to create their own version of the 300, as it's one of the most iconic battles in human history. And for what it's worth, it's a pretty engaging opening. It's well acted, there's good atmosphere and tone, a menacing and suspenseful score, awesome action choreography, you feel that sense of impending dread and death the Spartans feel, and the sheer amount of NPCs on screen really does feel like you're in the heat of battle. It's immersive and a strong way to introduce the player to the game's combat system, starting off as this overpowered Leonidas with several abilities already unlocked, which is really common for a lot of game openings. They'll start you off really strong, then strip all that power away and make you build your way back up throughout the game. However though, setting the game this far into the past begs a question that must be asked. Why set the game during this time period? It's a question I often pondered upon the game's release, because outside of people just wanting to see how Ubisoft would reconstruct ancient Greece and portray the Peloponnesian War, what reason in the scope of the series does this game have for existing? What justification does it have for having Assassin's Creed in its title, and what does it really bring or add to the general narrative? We had just gotten the origin story of the Assassin's Creed, starting as the Hidden Ones from Origins the year prior. Bayek and Aya co-founded the Brotherhood in 38 BC, nearly 400 years later. So after telling the origin story of the faction this entire series is about, to immediately set the next game before even that, nonetheless 400 years before that, is puzzling. It's one of the reasons I had such a hard time enjoying the game when it came out, because I just couldn't understand why this story in particular needed to be told in the scope of the franchise. Back then, you played an Assassin's Creed game and you expected to play as an assassin, or proto-assassin. You expected its story to be about and heavily involve the Assassin's Creed. Or at least you did up until that point, because that's what every game in the franchise was about, even in those you weren't always playing as an assassin. And it's why I believe Odyssey is not a good option to be your first Assassin's Creed game, despite being the earliest chronologically in the timeline, because you won't really get what Assassin's Creed is about at its core by playing this game, especially when it comes to trying to get a grasp on what the overall narrative is about. What's the Assassin's Creed? What's a Templar? What in the world is happening with this random modern day storyline? If you had someone who had no idea what Assassin's Creed was about and had them play Odyssey, they're not going to be much closer to understanding. Sure, Odyssey has pieces and similar themes to the rest of the franchise, and because it's closer to the first civilization than any other AC game has been on the timeline, there is a significant focus on the Izu and their artifacts. I mean, you're wielding one for the entirety of the game, whereas in AC games of the past, you may get a mission or two where you use the apple or some other piece of Eden. It was never something you always had. There are similar themes of freedom versus societal control in the narrative, with the secret cult controlling and pulling the strings of Greece from the shadows. The Cult of Cosmos bears a resemblance to the Order of Ancients and the Templars, as a shadowy organization with an obsession of Izu artifacts and descendants, despite not being a branch of the Order of Ancients themselves that we've seen in Origins, Valhalla, and Mirage. Although, as we learn in the DLC, the Persian branch of the Order were allies with the cult. But the Order of Ancients, the Proto-Templars, actually predates the cult by nearly 1,000 years, which makes one wonder why they elected to center this story around the cult when they could have just made it another branch of the Order of Ancients to bring a little more continuity with Origins and the rest of the series. Perhaps to demonstrate that no matter what organization it is, the philosophical battle and the desire to find these remnants of the first civilization is what endures through the centuries, and not the individual organization. And the story still tries to connect to the other games as best as it can. There's even a moment where you see visions of the future through this montage using footage of several of the game's cinematic trailers. But obviously, because the Hidden Ones haven't even been created yet, there's only so many ways this game can connect to the rest of the franchise. And this is one of the reasons why you'll so commonly see the phrase, "good game, bad Assassin's Creed game," when hearing others describe Odyssey. because as much as it tries to connect in the small amount of ways it can, it's still missing a lot of the fundamental pillars that make up an Assassin's Creed story. And especially at the time in 2018, that hadn't really happened before. So why do this? Why tell this story and why set the game before Origins? Obviously it's impossible to know the full extent of the true reasoning behind whomever at Ubisoft made the decisions, but it was likely the result of wanting to set a game during the Peloponnesian War, to explore and recreate the setting, and perhaps tell a different kind of AC story. Ubisoft Quebec clearly had an affinity for Greek mythology as well, as they would go on to make Immortals Fenyx Rising immediately after Odyssey, which feels like a game they really wanted to make. Many people say Odyssey would have been better received had it not been an AC game, and instead just a new, original Ancient Greece open world. It's impossible to know for sure how that may have turned out, and a lot of the game would have to be changed to fit that, and it's kind of a moot point because obviously it didn't happen. Though I certainly wouldn't mind seeing a new historical open world IP from Ubisoft, as they tend to just focus on their big cash cows now, instead of experimenting with new ideas as frequently. What's also interesting is I remember when it was first speculated that the next game after Origins would be taking the series to ancient Greece, many people thought the game would once again follow Bayek as he travels to Greece and continues to evolve the Hidden Ones. Then perhaps after, in the next game, he would go to Rome to make up an entire trilogy. It never happened, of course, but I always thought there was a lot of potential in that idea, especially with how well received Bayek's character was. Although the golden age of Greece, in which Odyssey takes place, is of course a lot more popular and commonly depicted in media, as opposed to the Hellenistic period where a Bayek sequel would have taken place. So that was likely a big contributing factor as to why the game is set when it is, even if a Bayek sequel might have made more sense for the overall narrative of the series. But bringing us back to the present day, we're reintroduced to the game's modern day protagonist, Layla Hassan, returning from Origins, which marks the first time since Desmond that we played as the same character in the modern day for more than one game. Picking up not too long after the modern day ending of Origins, Layla, a former Abstergo employee, now a new member of the modern day Assassins after accepting her invite from William Miles, discovers Leonidas' spear and uses the DNA extracted from it to enter the Animus, to experience the memories of Alexios or Cassandra. Layla is also now working with Victoria Bibot, making her first real appearance in the AC games after being mentioned in several of the games previously and appearing in some of the novels. I'll get more into modern day later, but it is very limited in Odyssey. If you're someone who doesn't care for modern day in Assassin's Creed, you probably don't mind, but for people like me who believe it is an essential part of these games, that's disappointing. And what little modern day there is, well, I'll save that for later. But once you enter the Animus, the game will bring you through the various options and settings you'd like for your playthrough. I like how they made these selection screens as if Layla is choosing these settings for herself for her own experience in the Animus. I like when Assassin's Creed leans into the Animus elements more and uses it in immersive ways like this. Choosing a gameplay mode was a new addition with Odyssey though, now allowing you to choose between guided or exploration. Guided mode being the typical way of playing where everything will be marked and the game will tell you exactly where to go, while with exploration mode, you'll get a few hints as to the general area of your objective and you're meant to discover it on your own. The addition of an exploration mode is a welcome one. It forces you to be more aware of your environment and requires you to use that brain of yours to discern the most likely place your objective would be at. It's also a bit more of a realistic and grounded way of exploring, as people aren't always going to give you specific locations and you're not going to always know exactly where to go. For me, this was a more fun, immersive, and engaging way to play, but for those who aren't into that, it's nice that they give a choice. Furthermore, to make my experience even more immersive, I fiddled around with the HUD settings a bit to make it look a bit more minimal and clean, so that my exploration would feel more natural. Instead of relying on the compass and running from question mark to question mark, I had to use my eyes to scan the environment, and if I saw something in the distance that piqued my interest, I'd go explore it and check it out. And to be rewarded by either finding a quest, or a cave, or tomb, felt a lot more gratifying than if I just followed exactly where the game told me to go. I've really liked turning down some of the HUD with a lot of Ubisoft games recently, because Ubisoft open worlds have always had the reputation of holding your hand, displaying lots of map markers, and killing some of the immersion of their games with how the HUDs tend to display overt amounts of information. So I really like playing a lot of the games this way, and what's great about Odyssey is you can customize virtually everything on the HUD. Where Origins only had specific presets and a limited amount of things you could have on or off, Odyssey lets you customize all of it, which I really appreciate as someone who now likes to play these games this way, and thankfully Valhalla and Mirage have continued this trend. Now, normally I'd like to turn off health bars as well, but you can't really do that with Odyssey because you can't one-shot assassinate everybody, and so you need health bars to see who you can and can't kill. After you choose your gameplay mode though, you're then required to make perhaps the biggest choice of the game of who you're going to experience this Odyssey as, Alexios or Cassandra. I didn't really know who I wanted to play as, so I let you guys choose for me through a YouTube community poll where Cassandra just nearly beat out Alexios, which was probably for the best anyway because the last time I played Odyssey was as Alexios. But just going off this poll and other conversations I've seen on Odyssey, the community is pretty split on who's the better option. Cassandra is the canon choice. She appears in Valhalla, the opening of the new mobile game Jade, and in Nexus, the VR game. But I know there's a lot of people who still prefer playing as Alexios. I've played as both now, and I can't really say I have a preference, but I will say Melisante Mahut turned in a good performance as Cassandra. She's very expressive and demonstrates quite a wide range of emotions throughout the game. The script doesn't always allow for moments for her to demonstrate that range, but when it does, she nails it. And honestly, a lot of the performances and dialogue in this game feel very awkward and wooden. Sometimes they just feel off. They don't feel nearly as natural as many of the games in the series prior to Odyssey, which is likely the result of direction and the sheer volume of lines the actors had to read through. Michael Antonakos, who voiced Alexios, said they would get hundreds of pages of dialogue only mere days before recording, leaving no real time to prepare, so they just had to read through. Which would explain why a lot of their performances can feel like the actors are reading from a script, because they are, and they haven't had a lot of time to prepare or interpret it. So that, with all the permutations of choice combined, it's not hard to see why some of these interactions feel a bit off. Don't get me wrong though, there are still some genuinely great performances in this game. I felt Marini's voice actress in particular killed it in a lot of her scenes, and like I said, Melisante's performance felt consistently good throughout the game. I remember a specific side quest where Cassandra reunites with an old childhood friend from Kephallonia, and she had this very soft, gentle, almost shy tone that I hadn't heard from her before. Like the kind when reuniting with someone you hadn't seen in a long time. And this was in a little side quest arc that had no significance on the main story. So that choice to play Cassandra that way in that specific quest really impressed me. That's a great attention to detail. Most of those big, emotional, and substantiated performances though come from the main story. But with the choice of who to play as made, we're introduced to the eagle-bearing Mystios humming one of the tracks of the game. While we're on the subject, they say there's two things you can rely on in any Ubisoft game despite everything else: a pretty world and a good soundtrack, and Odyssey fits that bill. The score for this game was composed by The Flight, who's returning for the soundtrack of Shadows, and Odyssey's soundtrack is pretty strong. It's not among my favorites of the franchise, because this is just such a stacked series when it comes to soundtracks, but it's well composed, varied, and it still invokes the feeling of Greece. As for this opening track, simply named Odyssey, it was a lullaby that Marini sang to Alexios and Cassandra when they were children, hence why they're humming the song while looking at the Spear of Leonidas, the spear that their mother gave them. It's not apparent in the first playthrough, but upon replaying the game, this was a cool detail I noticed, as it's clear Cassandra is thinking about her mother in this moment. And a variation of the same track, called Marini, plays again at the end of the game. I always like when games are able to tell a story just through the music. Cassandra's reminiscing though is quickly broken up by two thugs working for a man named the Cyclops, the Act 1 villain. They land a sucker punch on Cassandra where the game teaches you more of the basics of the combat. Odyssey's combat is built off the, at the time, relatively new hitbox timing and distance-based system introduced by Origins. albeit with a few tweaks. For one, the parrying was changed. You can't use a shield in this game, even though many of the enemy types do, and rather than having to hold an input to block with the shield or weapon, and then properly timing a parry with the strike from an enemy, in Odyssey, the parry is now a single input with far slower and more forgiving timing windows. Ubisoft Quebec aimed to make parrying simpler and easier to pull off for the player, in which they succeeded, but is that a good thing? Sure, parrying in Origins was nothing too special, and dozens of other games out there have done it better, but at least it took some skill and practice to master. There was a genuine challenge to it, and parry timings differed depending on the enemy. Some of them had very elaborate attacks that you could only learn the parry timings of after fighting them several times. It was more challenging and more rewarding to pull off a successful parry. There was a big risk-reward factor to it. This extended to dodging too. In Odyssey, parrying is extremely simple. There's not much skill involved with how easy it is to do and how blatantly enemies telegraph their attacks. Dodging is a bit easier too. You get more time to react, and a generous few seconds of slow motion every time you hit a well-timed dodge, the window to do so also being quite generous. Slow motion on a perfect dodge did exist in Origins, but the timing for a perfect dodge was much tighter, and slow motion did not last nearly as long as it does in Odyssey. Also, the ability to block is just completely gone. You could argue this is because there's no shield, but Origins allowed you to block without the shield on dual-wielded weapons, so I'm not sure what the reason for removing the blocking mechanic is. Despite dodging and parrying being easier though, this combat system can still have its challenges, especially on hard and nightmare difficulty. Why? Well, Odyssey's solution to increasing difficulty is inflating enemy health pools and their damage to where you'll die in a mere couple hits on hard and nightmare, which is a cheaper way of increasing the difficulty as opposed to making the AI smarter and more reactive, lessening your time to dodge or parry their attacks. Many of the enemies are complete damage sponges that can absorb dozens of lethal blows, which can not only make combat feel tedious over time, but completely kills any sense of realistic damage. You can slit someone's throat, stab them through the chest, and slice them up in numerous lethal ways, and they get up like it was just a paper cut, which feels ridiculous, especially when you're playing as this extremely strong mercenary from Sparta with an Izu spear. This is only made worse on the higher difficulties, where enemies have significantly more health, making combat at times feel like a grind in of itself. Now, granted, when you get to the late game, you can put together strong warrior builds and kill enemies relatively quickly, especially if you prioritize upgrading and getting engravings to support your abilities. I enjoyed trying to get creative and create all these different builds, as the game even lets you have multiple loadouts you can switch between. And there's so many different variations of gear, weapons, and abilities that make up all these different unique loadouts. Like, just look online, there's so many different types of builds people have come up with, and some people love that, but others don't want to have to consistently micromanage their gear and inventory just to get the most out of the game's systems. Should you have to optimize a build just for the combat to become more tolerable? Again, in all the previous games, that was never something you had to do. Unity tried to make it seem like optimizing a build would make a big difference, but it didn't really, and Odyssey succeeded at that, but for those who don't like to micromanage their stats and spend a long time in the inventory trying to set up and optimize a build, Odyssey kind of alienates that player, which is a pretty decent chunk of those who would have played Odyssey as fans of the previous Assassin's Creed games. Again, in those games, you could be good at combat and stealth equally. You didn't have to sacrifice stats from one to be better at the other. The combat also just lacks a general impact and weight behind its strikes. It can feel like you're hitting someone with a plastic sword. It's funny, I felt a similar way about another game's combat system. I'm sensing a bit of a pattern. For all Valhalla's flaws, this was an aspect of the combat they improved. Weapons actually have some weight behind them, and you can feel the impact of the damage you're doing. The finishing animations in Odyssey, though, do deliver some of that satisfying feedback, and they look very good, as they always do in these games, and each weapon type has a few different varying animations. But combat in general is just kind of bland. It's a simplified version of Origins combat, made artificially harder by increasing enemy health and damage, so that you have to rely on builds to negate the damage sponge. Parrying and weapon strikes feel weightless and lack satisfying feedback aside from the finishers, and many of the combat encounters devolve into the same loop of dodging, parrying, and spamming the best abilities, making it feel repetitive. You can fight a lot of the enemies in the exact same way as any other. They don't force you to use different strategies and abilities, except for those who have shields, but those are easily dealt with as well. Furthermore, there's not many distinctions between the faction of an enemy you're fighting. You could argue the old AC games' counter-based combat suffered a similar issue with repetition, but at least you had to fight some enemies differently, as few as they were, and it had style. Odyssey's combat looks boring in comparison. The depth in the combat comes from the builds and varying ways you can craft a combat style with your gear, weapon, and skills, but aside from that, to keep it fresh, it gets old after playing for so many hours. Combat is just not nearly deep or satisfying enough to sustain the 100 plus hours of gameplay the game offers. But after dealing with the Cyclops' two laughably pathetic minions, you're given a choice to kill or spare them. It's the first choice you'll get in a game of many choices. The Witcher 3 influence here is very apparent. Throughout the game, you'll be given a multitude of choices. In dialogue, you can lie, flirt, or choose to kill in certain situations. Many of the main story choices do genuinely have an impact on how the story plays out, and a bad choice you made at the start of the game can come back to haunt you later. By far, one of the most interesting being whether or not you choose to save a plague-infected family in Kephallonia at the start of the game. You can choose to save them and kill the priest, or let the priest kill the husband and wife along with their two children. If you save them, you might feel good about yourself, like you did the right thing, only to discover hours later when you come back to Kephallonia, the family ended up spreading the plague to the entire island, taking countless lives. While if you let the family die, you save Kephallonia, but know that you let an innocent family with two children be executed. And to make the feeling worse, one of them is Phoebe's friend, and she's devastated by your refusal to save them. It's a very challenging and complex moral dilemma with consequences and tragedy regardless of what you choose. And those are some of the best choices and tough positions an RPG can put you in. Again, this was something The Witcher 3 did so well, on countless occasions, and I wish there were more challenging moral dilemmas like this in Odyssey. There are more than just this example, of course, but not quite on the same level as a game like The Witcher or Baldur's Gate 3. To be fair though, those are very high bars to reach. But the most important thing is a lot of main story choices have impact and consequences. That's what makes them interesting and meaningful. Another good example I can think of is when you're given a choice of killing the monger out in the open at the theater or silently in a cave ambush. I chose the former because I thought it sounded more exciting killing him in front of a crowd and not really thinking it would impact much. Well, fast forward like 30 hours later, I'm investigating this cultist, and as it turns out, he doesn't really want to be a cultist. He's a good man and a farmer who had his family threatened, so I was going to let him live and help him escape the cult, only for him to not trust me because I publicly executed the monger 30 hours previously, and so he decides to go out fighting where I'm forced to kill him, leaving his wife a widow and his children fatherless. On top of that, he was an old friend of Brasidas, and now he hated me too. That small choice I had, that I thought had no big significance at the time, ended up coming back to bite me and make me feel like a horrible person way later. Those are the good kinds of consequences you can get from a choice-based story like this, and there are times where Odyssey does it genuinely very well, like a true RPG. But after making the decision though of whether or not to spare the Cyclops' thugs, although if you spare them they end up waiting to ambush you on the road anyway, we're then tasked with finding Marcos. Marcos, the man with a plan. Marcos practically raised Cassandra after finding her on the shores of Kephallonia, where they'd work together on numerous business ventures, with Marcos as the quote-unquote brains, and Cassandra as the brawn. Surely I can't be the only one who thought he'd end up being the final cultist. I mean, who talks like this?
Send them to Hades, then loot them for all they have. We'll be rich!
While talking to Marcos, Phoebe has been abducted by more of the Cyclops' minions, where the game teaches you the basics of stealth. Stealth in Odyssey? Well, there's some good and some bad. The good? The game lets you use stealth a lot. It's a genuine playstyle, and many missions encourage you to use it, especially on harder difficulties where combat with an entire outpost would mean certain death. There's great value in picking off targets from the shadows. Another good thing, a consistent detection system. Sure, the AI can still be the usual amount of stupid you see in nearly every Ubisoft game, but at least I wasn't getting spotted from across the other side of the planet like in Valhalla on launch. Another good thing is how guard behaviors and routes change based on the time of day. If you strike at night, many of them will be sleeping, bringing a little depth and variation to enemy behavior that you can exploit and strategize around. Much of the early game stealth revolves around using bushes and tall grass for cover and whistling to draw enemies in, as you don't have many of the assassin abilities yet. And of course, there's no social stealth in this game, so a lot of early game stealth is cover-based. But when you start getting those stronger abilities, things start to play out a little differently. The chain assassination from Origins has been replaced with the rush assassination ability. In fact, rush assassination works in a very similar way to Assassin's Focus from Mirage. You can throw the Spear of Leonidas at a distant enemy to effectively teleport to them, and then chain it to 3 other nearby enemies when you have it fully upgraded. And like Assassin's Focus, this can be used as a form of movement to get to an area or elevation much quicker than if you were to run or climb there. And thankfully, so long as you rush assassinate the first enemy before being detected, you can chain the kills even if the others have spotted you. I'm still not the biggest fan of how rush assassination looks, with you essentially teleporting around, but I did find it extremely strong in stealth. And again, especially if you create an assassin build, it can do serious damage. It does cost adrenaline to use, while in Origins the chain assassination was just a skill you always had, but it kind of balances itself out since rush assassination is far stronger, especially when you get it fully upgraded. With the Shadow of Nyx ability, you can turn invisible, which again, I don't necessarily love because it tends to make Odyssey feel more like a fantasy game than what is typical in Assassin's Creed, which a lot of people, including myself, were never really a big fan of. Assassin's Creed was never fully realistic, we all know that. Obviously we had things like Pieces of Eden, the Izu, and some weapons and certain moves that may not have been realistically possible in those time periods, but those exaggerated and fictional elements of Assassin's Creed never went too far. It was very much historical fiction, but it never crossed the line into being fantasy. Grounded, but not completely realistic. However, in the context of the series and being a video game, it was still believable. Origins definitely brought a shift in this before Odyssey did. We had elemental effects like magic fire on weapons, and Origins leaned more into mythology, especially in the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC. But Odyssey certainly took all that a step further. A big reason for that is Leonidas' spear, which grants the player these magic-like abilities, like invisibility, shooting beams of light, teleportation, surviving a fall off a huge mountain without a scratch, supercharged Spartan kicks, though those are admittedly very fun. Which is all explained by having an Izu spear. It's not like they're saying flat out magic is a thing in the AC universe now, but it does certainly make gameplay feel more like what you come to expect out of a fantasy RPG and not a grounded historical fiction. And it certainly doesn't help when you can have these ridiculously over-the-top skins and ride a unicorn, which is why I try to refrain from using them, because it's just hard to keep the immersion and take the story seriously with some of these skins. Odyssey leaned more into mythology as well, with the different Greek mythological monsters you can fight. The Cyclops, Medusa, the Steropes, the Minotaur, even the lost city of Atlantis. But this is once again explained within the AC lore as creations of the Izu and Pieces of Eden, which is a pretty clever way to do it, to be fair, putting an Assassin's Creed Izu twist on Greek mythology. They did the same for Egyptian and Norse mythology for Origins and Valhalla. I still personally prefer a more grounded take on Assassin's Creed games. I think a more realistic take on ancient Greece without the crazy abilities and fantasy elements, in line with some of the older AC games, could have been really cool. And I will say, as silly as it can be fighting these mythological monsters in an Assassin's Creed game, the boss fights themselves were still quite fun, and they're well designed visually. Plus, most of them have pretty engaging quest lines, so that when you finally do reach that final boss fight with them, it feels grand and it feels earned. But Odyssey certainly teeters that line of historical fiction and fantasy more than any game in the series before and after it. Just from what we've seen, from what Ubisoft Quebec has done with Shadows so far, it does seem to be more grounded, at least in gameplay. Neither of the characters have Izu weapons with these magical abilities or anything, but it's hard to tell until we actually get our hands on the game, and I'm sure it'll be chock full of those glowing skins. The abilities are what makes Odyssey's stealth unique from the rest of the franchise, but only a couple add meaningful depth. Alright, now let's talk about the bad. For one, assassinations don't always kill people.
I'm not an assassin.
Yeah, no shit. Which inherently isn't actually the real problem. The idea of having certain enemies that can't be instantly killed in stealth to pose a bigger threat and obstacle to the player's stealth run is a decent idea conceptually. It brings a wrinkle into stealth, forcing the player to strategize and think of ways to deal with that target or work around them. The problem with how Odyssey does this, however, is there's no visual cue aside from the health bar as to what enemies can and can't be instantly assassinated. Some enemy types have more health than others, like brutes, captains, and commanders. It also depends on their level, but to see if you can one-shot assassinate them or not, you have to awkwardly position yourself near them to see their health bar, which can very easily result in you getting too close and being detected. Now, it seems like this is something Ubisoft Quebec actually took feedback on and is changing for Shadows. As in some of the gameplay released, we can see there's an enemy that can't be assassinated, but they have this massive armor on that gives you a very clear visual cue that that's not someone you can assassinate without first having to break their armor. So from a distance, if I see that enemy, I know I should probably avoid them in stealth. Whereas in Odyssey, you don't know if you can kill them or not until you get right next to them. Furthermore, even with an assassin build, and especially in the early to mid game before you get crazy stats, there's still a lot of enemies you won't be able to assassinate. For many, you'll have to rely on critical assassination, a skill you unlock that uses adrenaline to increase your assassin damage when going for an assassination. But there's a couple problems with critical assassination. For one, it can feel awkward to use because you have to hold the assassination input. At least you'll have a brief moment of slow motion when you're detected if you have the Sixth Sense ability, so you actually have time to do a critical assassination, but it also doesn't tell you if a critical assassination will kill the target you're about to use it on. You can try and infer the best you can by looking at how much damage a regular assassination will do when looking at the health bar, but the health bar doesn't portray how much damage a critical assassination will inflict. So it can screw you over if you critical assassinate someone and it's not enough to kill them, and then you're spotted and everyone knows where you are. It's annoyances like that make me wonder why critical assassination is even needed, instead of just boosting the base damage of general assassinations. Because Origins worked completely fine without something like critical assassination, and you could still one-shot assassinate most enemies in that game if you had your hidden blade upgraded. I suppose to further incentivize players to go the route of an assassin build by giving more abilities to support it, but not being able to assassinate some enemies in an Assassin's Creed game because you aren't a high enough level or don't have high enough stats is understandably frustrating to a lot of people. Thankfully, it seems like Shadows will be foregoing critical assassinations and going more the route of Mirage, where most enemies will be able to be assassinated, and then there will be a specific enemy type that can't be. In Mirage, this was the hunters that get sent after you when you reach max notoriety, whereas in Shadows, this appears to be this brute enemy with the massive armor. There's some other weird regressions from Origins stealth in Odyssey as well though. Sleeping and poison darts are gone, you can no longer berserk enemies to have them fight each other, you can't trap dead bodies with poison, contextual smoke bombs that could be used after dodging or a melee attack are also gone. You do have the Vanish of Light ability in Odyssey, but it's not exactly the same thing. The ranged options have also been streamlined. Whereas in Origins, you have different types of bows with their own specialties, where you would have to strategically choose which ones to use, as some were very strong at close range, like the warrior bows, while others, like the predator bows, were more effective for stealth and long-range encounters. Odyssey got rid of all those, and instead you have one bow with hunter abilities. All the bow types have sort of been mashed together into one. You have the controllable arrows like the Predator bow from Origins, although using the Predator bow in Origins gave you this cool first-person perspective of the bow in your hands, while in Odyssey it's just a plain reticle. The spread shot is meant to be like the warrior bow that's strong at close range, but there's no such ability equivalent to the light bows from Origins, which isn't a huge deal, though I did enjoy using the light bow in Origins. But there are new abilities as well, like Ghost Arrows, Devastating Shot, and Rain of Destruction. You also have a lot more arrow capacity. They can be crafted using wood now, which you'll always have an abundance of, and you can even set it to automatically craft arrows when you run out, which ensures you'll pretty much never run out. You can also now have several different arrow types, even though some bows will automatically have poison or fire arrows already. Of course, there's a possibility of creating a hunter build, which can be pretty fun and strong to use, but if you don't have a hunter build, the bow does not feel nearly as strong as it did in Origins. Generally, I found the bows in Origins to be more satisfying to use, allowing you to have two different types of bows equipped that you could switch between on the fly for more diverse gameplay, while not relying on adrenaline and hunter abilities. Another big thing that differentiates stealth in Odyssey from the rest of the franchise, though, is this is the first and only game where you don't have a hidden blade as your stealth weapon. As narratively, it wouldn't make a lot of sense for Alexios or Cassandra to have a hidden blade, as the origins of the weapon are explored in the Legacy of the First Blade DLC. But another reason is because the Spear of Leonidas has a lot of narrative significance in Odyssey. This was something that kinda bothered me on release. Just because the hidden blade is such a cool and iconic weapon, you see it and you immediately think of Assassin's Creed. It's one of, if not perhaps the most identifiable thing with the series, and Odyssey not having it available for you to use kind of perfectly symbolizes how much of an outlier this game is from the rest of the franchise. But I'm not going to be dramatic and pretend it's an absolutely huge deal that we don't use the hidden blade, even though I would prefer to have it. But really my issue with the spear is the assassination animations. Not that they look bad, they're very well animated, but some of them are quite long and drawn out, as Cassandra and Alexios kill people in, shall we say, creative ways. I prefer when the animations are quicker, as you can just kill someone very fast and get back into stealth, and not be put at too much risk of being detected while performing an assassination. But because some of these animations with Odyssey can take a bit longer, they can occasionally leave you exposed for too long, where a nearby guard may catch you in the act of an assassination. Which is why the simplest assassinations are actually my favorites of the game. The high-profile sprinting one, and then the one where it's just a very quick stab. That way you take them out very quickly, and you're already moving on to the next target with little risk involved. After that initial stealth mission and saving Phoebe from the Cyclops' thugs, she informs Cassandra that a bounty has been placed on her, and Talos the Stonefist is coming to collect it. The mercenary system is one of the best additions the RPG Creeds made. The idea of being hunted by these tough, high-level enemies in the open world as a direct consequence for your actions fits perfectly within Assassin's Creed. This was a system first introduced by Origins with the Phylaketize, and Odyssey's is mostly an improvement on the system. The biggest addition Odyssey made was to tie how many mercenaries would be hunting you down to a notoriety bar. So if you steal, kill, or do other illegal activities in public view, the bar increases, and you'll have more mercenaries sent after you the higher it gets. Meaning there are direct consequences to not behaving in public. And because the mercenaries can be such a pain to deal with, it's a very strong motivator to refrain from illegal activity in the open, or think of a clever way to pull it off without being seen by any civilians. It's kind of like the notoriety system from Mirage, except it's only mercenaries being sent after you. There won't be city guards or archers on high alert in the cities. You then clear that notoriety by either killing the sponsor, whom you can find somewhere in the world, or by simply going into the map and paying it off. Which is too easy to do. If you're doing a fair amount of side quests and treasure hunting, paying off the bounty with drachmae is going to be a drop in the bucket. It makes it way too easy to escape the consequences of getting high notoriety, which is why I often didn't pay it off, even though I very easily could have. I want the consequences and the challenge the game will throw at me for not following the rules. The mercenaries typically have a lot of health, maybe an animal companion, and they're very clearly magnetized to your general position, as they usually show up within 100 meters almost immediately after your notoriety increases. It's clear the game cheats a bit and has them spawn near you, Whereas in Origins, the Philokatais would be roaming the world, not having much of an idea as to where you are, so when you encountered them, it felt more natural. But having the mercenaries be magnetized to your location isn't entirely a bad thing. It can be frustrating, especially when you're trying to stealthily clear an outpost or something and they just walk right in, but this brings those direct consequences to your actions. Because they spawn near you when your notoriety is up, you're feeling a more immediate impact and challenge caused by whatever illegal act you did. So while it is frustrating to be fighting a guard or trying to stealthily clear an outpost just to be ambushed by a bunch of high-level mercenaries, those experiences made me a lot more cautious in the future, because I didn't want them coming out of nowhere and ruining my day, so I was a lot more careful in managing my notoriety. The mercenaries each have a unique name and loadout, in an attempt to make each one feel a bit distinct, though most of them have recycled movesets depending on the weapon they're using. So after you fought a couple, they kinda start to blend together and feel the same. But since there's literally an unlimited amount of them, because the game auto-generates them, it would be practically impossible to make each one feel completely unique. It's still a system with a few flaws, but generally, this is one of my favorite additions the RPG games introduced to the Assassin's Creed formula, and hopefully it's expanded upon in Shadows. But after dealing with Talos the Stonefist, we head back to Marcos, who tells us to steal the Cyclops' obsidian eye. If you do this stealthily, the Cyclops and his men would be none the wiser, but if you're spotted, when you return to Marcos' vineyard, it'll be under attack by the Cyclops' men. After that's done though, Marcos informs us that some strange visitors have arrived on the shores of Kephallonia, and that we should greet them. After killing the strange visitors, Cassandra meets a mysterious man named Elpinor, who tasks Cassandra with acquiring the Shroud of Penelope to prove her worth, and then gives her a contract to assassinate the Wolf of Sparta in Megaris. To get to Megaris, she'll need a ship, so she goes to steal one from the Cyclops, where we finally meet our Act 1 villain.
May I? Give it to me. Give it to me and I won't kill Marcos for having you steal it! Give it to me!
You want it? Go get it.
Tonally, the story of Odyssey is really strange. It's very inconsistent. What should be more serious or tense moments are often undercut with comedy. This is an issue a lot of people have with Odyssey, where it feels like storytelling can be sacrificed for comedic effect. And Odyssey loves to tell jokes. Some are funny.
You look cute right now, as if nothing can get in your way.
I don't usually like being called cute.
Alright, you're ugly then.
Some are not. In fact, most of the funniest parts of the game came from the unscripted moments.
I might be injured, but I can still kill you!
Generally, the main plot once you leave Kephallonia is fairly serious. There's still those moments of goofiness here and there, which is just the kind of tone and vibe Ubisoft Quebec wanted to go for, but most of that is in the side content. The main plot still has its darker, more serious moments, a little more in line with the kind of tone you would expect from Assassin's Creed. But in Odyssey, a lot of the characters have this very strange, upbeat vibe to them almost all the time. They're very cheery and exaggerated, and it's kind of off-putting, which doesn't feel grounded or appropriate for the setting, as there's this brutal war going on. It's like they're not aware of the situation at all. I don't know, it makes a lot of these characters feel weirdly uncanny, like they're not people. Maybe part of that is the voice acting as well, but some of these interactions just feel really bizarre. And take this confrontation with the Cyclops. This guy is built up throughout the first act as this brutal, cruel, and very feared dictator of Kephallonia, essentially, and then you meet him and he feels like a cartoon villain. He's drowning Barnabas for calling him the Cyclops, because he doesn't like being called that, even though his own men call him that.
Cyclops got a message for you.
You're running out of time until the Cyclops comes for you, Malaka.
Then you put his eye in a goat's butt and he screams like a little girl. And I'm meant to fear this villain? I'm meant to take him seriously? Because that's what it was setting up for. Funnily enough, this was a very similar issue I had with Syndicate's story. Like, these are dark and brutal times these games are set in, but they often have this weirdly upbeat, light tone that doesn't feel like it fits within the setting of the game. Honestly, this use of comedy and the goofier tones is something I've noticed in a lot of recent Ubisoft games. I don't know why, I'm not sure if it's intentional, but even in games like Far Cry 6 and Watch Dogs Legion, they have a lot of goofiness. Just like, haha, let's become these brutal mass murderers and make jokes and quips about it all the time. Another thing that likely attributes to this uncanny feeling of the interactions with a bunch of the characters is the animation. I talk about the cutscene presentation with the AC games a lot on this channel, because this is an area where Ubisoft games have really regressed recently in my eyes. And really it's an issue that started in Odyssey and then continued in Valhalla and Mirage. Because most of Origin's cutscenes are fantastic from a visual standpoint, and to go from that to how they look for a majority of Odyssey is jarring. There are reasons for this, of course. For one, Odyssey is a choice-based game, so with different possible interactions and outcomes for a lot of the cutscenes, Ubisoft used procedural generation to animate a lot of the cutscenes as opposed to motion-captured animations, which saves a lot of time and money in a game where there are so many cutscenes and cinematics. There are still a small handful of scenes in the main story that use motion capture, and it's immediately noticeable by how different it looks from the rest of the game in comparison, but these kinds of scenes are spread out through the game and only saved for the important moments. So the rest of the procedurally generated interactions feel very stiff, awkward, and lifeless. The character movements just don't look real. If I was talking to someone and they constantly were flailing their arms around and making these robotic gestures, I'd think there might be something wrong with them. Another downside to using this procedural generation is it doesn't allow for very interesting cinematography. Many of the camera angles are static and bland, and there's nothing interesting about the frame. One character talks, the frame focuses on them, the other character talks and then it focuses on them, back and forth, over and over, for who knows how many interactions. Every once in a while, the frame will focus on something in the background, but the only memorable shots to me in this game are in those mo-capped scenes, where they get a little more dynamic and creative with the camera. In fact, you'll even notice that whenever there is a motion-captured cutscene, the game will fade to black, back into a procedurally generated one when you have to make a choice. Odyssey is not the only RPG out there to use procedural generation. Again, to use the golden standard, a game like The Witcher 3 uses it a lot too, because it is a big game as well with many choices. Though most of those scenes still look better than many of Odyssey's to me, and it probably helps that the characters generally have better writing and dialogue, but unfortunately many of those higher quality mo-capped scenes are a casualty when opting to have choice in the game. Odyssey still uses motion capture more than Valhalla and Mirage though, weirdly, and when it does have those mo-capped scenes, they look really good. But unfortunately, a large chunk of cutscenes don't look like that, and the believability and authenticity of some of the scenes are harmed as a result. I'm hoping for more mo-capped scenes and shadows, but for those who are hoping to have cutscene quality back on par with what we used to have in the series, we're probably gonna have to wait for Codename Hexe for that, as it's rumored to be a more linear game, where it'll be a tighter, leaner experience that likely won't have any RPG-style choices, I'd imagine, which should present the opportunity for extended use of motion capture throughout. But after killing the Cyclops and rescuing Barnabas, he offers Cassandra his ship and crew, the Adrestia. I like Barnabas, he's a fun sidekick to have throughout your adventure, and he has a questline involving his nephew that was one of the more memorable side quest arcs of the game for me. But after getting aboard the Adrestia and leaving Kephallonia behind, we're hit with a massive revelation as to the identity of the Spartan general we've been contracted to kill, propelling us forward on our Odyssey.
Get me to Megaris. Now!
But I don't understand. Of all the places under Ilios, why risk our necks to go there?
The Wolf of Sparta is my father.
The inspiration for Assassin's Creed Odyssey's adventure is clear, it's right there in the title. The Odyssey is an epic ancient Greek poem written by the poet Homer, as it follows Odysseus and his 10-year adventure to return home after the Trojan War and reunite with his family, as he sails the seas, battles mythological creatures, and survives countless perilous adventures. Ubisoft Quebec's goal was to deliver players their own ancient Greek Odyssey, to deliver that feeling of a grand journey filled with adventure, and this is unquestionably one of Odyssey's greatest strengths as a game: the feeling of adventure, the ability to sail the seas, explore countless regions of ancient Greece, and experience hundreds of different stories and adventures, many of whose outcomes are impacted by your choices. There's an incredibly freeing feeling you get when you finally leave Kephallonia, the place where our main character had stayed trapped in almost their entire lives, and to just be let loose in this beautiful, massive world to go explore the unknown. It's like those moments in games where you open the door, sometimes literally, into the sprawling world you're about to sink your teeth into for hours on end. And to Odyssey's credit, because of its scale, a mission structure that lets you tackle main story and side content at your own pace, dozens of islands, regions, and unique locations to explore, all while being completely seamless with no loading screens to take you out of your adventure, it delivers on that sense of journey, that Odyssey, extremely well. And by the end, you really do feel like you've been through so much, like you're Odysseus in the story. And a lot of this starts with your ship. There is no Odyssey without the Adrestia. Odyssey features naval the most in the series since Black Flag and Rogue. Unity and Syndicate obviously didn't have any. Origins, kind of like how AC3 did back when naval was first introduced, had it for specific linear missions, but it wasn't something you had access to in the open world. And like Black Flag did coming off AC3, Odyssey took the base of the naval in Origins, fleshed it out some more, and made it a core pillar of its gameplay experience that you use to traverse the world and reach new shores. The ability to just seamlessly go from land onto your ship and then travel to wherever in this huge world you want is such a liberating feeling. And it certainly helps when the game looks as good as it does, especially the water. My goodness, the water in this game is breathtaking. With the different shades of blue, the dynamic waves, and volumetric foam, it just feels good to look at and travel in. It's almost a therapeutic experience when you're not being fired upon by pirates. And it really needed to be for a game in Greece, where one of the most immediate things you think of would be that stunning blue water. And again, what makes this naval traversal feel even more immersive than a game like Black Flag is that there are no loading screens. You can go to any city, island, or general area of the game you can think of without a single loading screen. This wasn't possible in Black Flag for the larger cities, but it is in Odyssey, and it makes general naval traversal so seamless. You can also just leave the helm of your ship at any time so long as you're not in combat, and dive overboard wherever you want. And whereas in Black Flag, when you went underwater on the open seas, you'd be restricted to a stealth swim, keeping you near the surface, Odyssey gives you the freedom to dive down to your heart's content, even in the depths of the ocean. And with the amount of detail they put into these underwater areas, whether it's sunken temples or shipwrecks, with all the fish, sharks, and even whales, makes it far more interesting to do so. There is quite a bit of ship customization as well. You can customize the appearance with the sails, the figurehead, and even the crew. Although similar to some of the outfit customization, I dislike how silly and over the top some of these skins can be. Nothing shatters immersion more than having a futuristic looking ship or the Rooks from Syndicate as your crew. And I will say, the sea shanties aren't nearly as memorable as Black Flag's. But obviously, a big difference between the naval in Odyssey and Black Flag is with the combat. In Black Flag, you are a Caribbean pirate using cannons and swivel guns, whereas in Odyssey, you're using bows and javelins accurate to the time. So, as a result, Odyssey's naval combat is a little more up close and personal. You don't have quite as much range, and there's a heavy emphasis on ramming ships, which is an element of the naval combat they expanded upon from the old system in Black Flag and Rogue. You hold an input to go into ramming speed, where your rowers have a set amount of stamina, and depending on the speed and angle of where you ram an enemy ship, you can deal serious damage. If they're low enough and you hit the ship at the right angle, you can even cleave it in two, which is very satisfying to pull off. You get this great feedback, a dynamic camera, and you get more resources for cleaving a ship, encouraging you to do it often. This was without a doubt the best improvement Odyssey made to naval combat. Like Black Flag and Rogue, you can also board enemy ships for more rewards, and once again, there's no form of loading screen or cutscene after a successful board. You just jump back onto your ship, it's all completely seamless. You can even stay on or watch the ship as it sinks to the depths of the ocean, as the corpses of your enemies float to the surface of the water. It's very cathartic. One area of naval that is a regression of the old system though is general movement. Similar to movement on land with your character, the ship's movement options have been streamlined. In the older titles, you had more fine-tuned control over the speed of your ship by adjusting the sails. So when you needed to slow down to get a sharper turning speed, it was very easy to do. But with Odyssey, you get travel speed, ramming speed, and then just a default speed you have no control over, and a full stop. So the only way you can get those sharper turns is by bringing your ship to a full stop. You just have less control over your own movement, likely in another attempt to streamline controls and pander to a larger audience, not requiring the player to learn the different inputs, which is exactly what they did with on-ground movement by removing the sprint input and having a default running speed, which I find quite stupid. Another new addition to Odyssey's naval were the lieutenants. You can knock out and recruit nearly anyone in the open world, including mercenaries, to be a lieutenant in your crew. Or some quests will give you the opportunity to recruit certain characters, and they'll give you stat bonuses that aid with ship combat, be it ship health, ramming stamina, damage with javelins, etc. One of them can even be summoned to assist you with the call to arms ability. I wish they did a little bit more than just bringing some mostly negligible bonuses to your ship though. It's a good idea with a lot of potential, but the execution is kind of underwhelming. And having an off-brand Bayek and IO board is a little disturbing. Plus, it doesn't help that all the best lieutenants are locked behind a paywall. In returning to this game though, the naval was, to my delight, one of the most enjoyable parts of the game for me. It might, unironically, be a better pirate game than Skull and Bones. I really did myself a disservice when I first played this game because I didn't use the Adrestia all that much. I would just fast travel to save time whenever possible, which can really nullify the point of the ship to begin with. And it's just generally fun to sail the seas in this game, so this time around, I really didn't find myself wanting to fast travel that often, unless my destination was just an absurdly long distance. But just getting on your ship and traveling to a new region of the world, maybe stopping to explore some interesting island you see along the way, or seeing a whale jump out of the water, that's part of the fun. That's what makes the game feel like an adventure. It's the journey, not the destination. And when you have a world like ancient Greece to explore, there's plenty of reason to do so. How the hell have I gone this long without just marveling at how well ancient Greece has been constructed in this game? From a visual standpoint, it's gorgeous. It's not even necessarily the fidelity or all the different technology that goes into making a game look like this. A large part of it is the aesthetic, the color palette, the scale of some of the locations, and the detail that went into the cities and architecture. This world is very vibrant and colorful. It really pops. The bright blues of the sky and water, the pinks of the flowers and shrubbery, the whites of the beaches and marble, it's very pleasing on the eyes, and I never got tired of looking at this game. I've played some games that are just so dull and brown and washed out looking that I'd literally get tired of looking at it. But even with who knows how many hours spent in this world, I never felt that way. There's almost always something visually interesting or appealing in every location. And because so much of Greece is mountainous, there's a huge sense of scale to a lot of the regions that create these beautiful vistas. It's a good thing there's a photo mode, cause you're gonna use it. Allowing players to share their screenshots with each other through the map was a pretty smart move. Many of the regions are still visually distinct too, from snow-capped mountains, volcanic islands, red lakes, and the different Izu structures. It helps keep the world feeling fresh after so many hours. This world is also the largest of the entire series, and you know it's massive when you're 80 hours in and still haven't even been to some entire regions, because the main story doesn't take you there. Having a large world has its downsides though. For one, because of its scale, it's clear some areas of the world got a lot more love and attention to detail from the developers than others, as you can find some areas that don't have much going for them apart from empty space or a copied location. But the biggest downside and weakness of Odyssey's open world is parkour design. In a series where parkour is so important to the Assassin's Creed gameplay loop, Odyssey places very little focus on trying to improve it in any way from its predecessor, Origins. I'd actually argue it's worse. In its world, it's so open and mostly barren with long stretches of open space where parkour isn't viable, making it feel like more of an afterthought in the game. Parkour? An afterthought in an Assassin's Creed game? There was a time when this wasn't commonplace. It wasn't something we were used to. Even in the marketing, parkour was barely being talked about in the build-up to the game's release, and it's clear it just wasn't much of a priority for Ubisoft Quebec. On top of that, Ubisoft Quebec has seemingly always lacked when it comes to designing their worlds for parkour. They know how to make some beautifully detailed worlds that bring these settings back to life, but they haven't demonstrated an affinity or deep understanding of how to make a parkour playground and a fun world to traverse for the player. Syndicate's recreation of Victorian London is stunning, but its parkour design is among the worst of the series. Some people may attribute that to London just not being an ideal city for creating good parkour routes and pathways, with its wide streets and tall structures, even though Assassin's Creed has always bent the rules and constructions of its cities to create these jungle gym-like environments for players to express themselves in. But that excuse of the world having bad parkour design because they were trying to keep the cities realistic to how they really were, doesn't apply for Odyssey. The cities of ancient Greece may be some of the most rich and ripe for parkour design. Many of the cities had no urban planning, and with structures so close and built on different elevations and in different unique positions, I couldn't think of a more ideal scenario for fun and fluid parkour design. And yet the result is incredibly underwhelming. There's no real parkour routes or highways to take in the cities that let you go from rooftop to rooftop and building to building without touching the ground. Even in a city like Athens that should be a prime opportunity for strong parkour design, there's a complete lack of flow and routes to take when trying to traverse the city. I only saw a couple corner swings throughout the entire game. And this obviously is done no favors by the fact that the movement mechanics are incredibly clunky and basic. It has the same issues as Origins parkour. The ejects are extremely contextual and really only usable when you go out of your way to do so. There's no manual jump button, not even a sprint button. Just go forward while holding the parkour input. It's bland, it's boring, and it feels very automated. You have very little control or room to actually improve and master this system. It allows for hardly any creative expression through the use of movement. What's more, as you progress through the game, you no longer take fall damage. So any sense of danger or risk involved with parkour, where in the old games making a bad mistake could prove fatal, any of that kind of tension and thrill is completely negated, because no matter what mistake you make, no matter where you jump from, you'll be completely fine. Through playing Syndicate and Odyssey, it's clear parkour design is one of Ubisoft Quebec's biggest weaknesses in designing their worlds. From what little we've seen of Shadows' parkour so far, I'm not entirely optimistic that's going to improve either. And in a series where parkour is so important and sets it apart from the other open world game series in the market, having it be this stripped down and basic is frustrating. Especially when you can point to the earliest games that came out over a decade before Odyssey and say they were a million times better. A lot of people play these games for parkour, and this is just one of the ways Odyssey is a departure from what makes an Assassin's Creed game an Assassin's Creed game. Ancient Greece has been beautifully recreated, it really has. The world alone probably makes this a must-play for any history buff with an interest in ancient Greece, but an immediate turn-off to any parkour enthusiast. A new feature that was heavily marketed for Odyssey's open world was how you could impact which faction had control over a specific territory in the Peloponnesian War. So by killing soldiers of Sparta or Athens, burning their war supplies, pillaging their nation chests, and assassinating their state leaders, you could trigger a massive conquest battle and change who owned that territory. It's a really unique and intriguing idea. You can change the tide of the war between Athens and Sparta? Well, you really can't. All it really accomplishes is changing the color and banner of those reigning over that territory. There is a certain satisfaction to be had seeing an outpost be taken over by the faction you aided, or a state leader that you helped rise to power, but you can't make any impact on the actual war. I guess they wanted to keep history set in stone, and fair enough, even though you never get to see the resolution of the war in the main plot. It's really more of a backdrop for the story of a mercenary trying to reunite their family. But the idea is a strong one. I just would have preferred if there was more impact and consequences that stemmed from it. Sure, you get some rewards for winning a conquest battle, and sometimes the story requires you to help a certain faction take over a region in order to progress the story, but outside of that, there's not a lot of reason to do so. When I know I'm not making any actual impact on the war or the story by helping Athens or Sparta take power, it kind of kills the motivation to do so. And I get that you're playing as a mercenary, but it's still strange that you can screw over Athens and Sparta as much as you want in the open world, and there will be no consequences in the story whatsoever. When I'm meeting the Spartan kings, I figured they might be mad that I slaughtered entire legions of their soldiers and single-handedly helped Athens take over several of their territories, but nope, not even a mention. And it's not like you really get to choose what side you want to help achieve victory. I guess you're meant to be the mercenary that kind of flip-flops and fights for both sides, but the main plot will push you back to Sparta in the end anyway. So any choice I make on who to help ends up feeling hollow and meaningless. The game presents it in a way that makes you think your choice matters and will have ramifications, but they don't. And that feels like a missed opportunity. The conquest battles themselves are initially pretty epic. We've never had such large-scale battles in an Assassin's Creed game before. With all these NPCs on screen, it feels grand. The novelty kind of wears off after doing these for a while though, as they're just simple battle royales in an open field with not much variation. I still enjoyed these, but it would have been nice if there were different types of battles, rather than just having Spartans and Athenians hacking away at each other in an open field, which is not only not very realistic to the types of battles they would have had, but it also gets a bit repetitive after doing it so many times. Some territories do have naval conquest battles, which is a nice bit of variation, but I would have liked more. But where a lot of RPGs are made or broken is in the side content. Especially in the case of a game like Odyssey, where there's more time to be spent in the side content than the main plot itself. Side quests are crucial to any good RPG experience, and after Origins took the Witcher 3 approach in designing side quests, making sure every quest had a story attached to it to engage the player, Odyssey continued that, but is perhaps even more like The Witcher 3 with its choices. Though, make no mistake, the writing quality is not nearly of the same level, but Odyssey has some genuinely great side quest arcs that felt like they got a lot of time and effort put into them. Some of these can run on for an hour with different potential endings to the arc depending on the choices you make. I couldn't believe some of them were completely optional. The rebellion on the Silver Islands really sticks out in my memory. You come to this island to aid its rebellion and leader Kira, no, not that Kira, as they fight against their Athenian oppressors. There's tons of twists and turns and so much story and well-written characters. There's so many different endings you can get. I couldn't believe it was possible for some people to miss this. Others I remember really well are the arena arc with Skora, the twin sister rivalry, the Battle of 100 Hands. I mean, that quest arc had this entire battlefield built and designed specifically for this quest. These kinds of quests were really well done. They felt like they were of a high quality and that a lot of time was spent on them. These are the types of quests where Odyssey is at its peak. However, not every quest is like this, and this is a very bloated game, inflated by many of these lower quality quests. There are a lot of randomly generated quests where it's just simply talking to someone, agreeing to deliver something for them, run like 100 or 200 meters and deliver the item, and that's it. That's the whole quest. There are several where you just go kill someone or a couple enemies and return. There's barely any story. The characters do give some kind of exposition, but it's not nearly enough to make you care or become invested in it, and many of Alexios and Cassandra's voice lines are copied and pasted in these quests. If there were only a couple of these here and there, it wouldn't be a big deal, but they are everywhere. And because they are randomly generated, there are times where you will find the exact same quest copied and pasted from before. Same objective, same voice lines and everything, just on a different character model.
My husband is a soldier, a true Spartan. When he is home, I play the lyre softly while he tells me of his battles and strokes my hair. My husband is a soldier, a true Spartan. When he is home, I play the lyre softly while he tells me of his battles and strokes my hair.
I'm not interested in your home life, musician. Get to the point.
I want to send him a lock of my hair. But we are Spartan. He might like it better if I dedicated the death of an Athenian leader to him.
How sweet.
It is good to be in love, Mystios.
This just feels like a way of bloating the game's runtime and side content with filler, and it dilutes the experience because you have some genuinely great, well thought out and handcrafted quest arcs, but a lot of those 150 hours you can get from the game are padded out by these lower effort generated quests. So in Shadows, I hope to either see these are gone with all the attention and effort put into those substantial quest arcs, or just tone down how many are being generated in the world, because it makes Odyssey a very bloated game, and unnecessarily so. It makes me appreciate The Witcher 3 more for only having these high effort and quality quests, and not diluting the quality of the side content with auto-generated monster contracts or something. But speaking of bloat, that's a word many would associate with Odyssey's loot and gear system. But my problem with the gear isn't so much the fact that you're constantly getting new stuff and having to change around your inventory, because once I found a gear set I liked, I didn't have to switch out of it because I could just keep upgrading it, and with a transmog system to change the cosmetics of your gear without actually having to change it and lose the stats, I never had a lot of reason to change gear once I found a set I liked. What frustrates me though is constantly having to go to a blacksmith to sell or dismantle gear, and because you get so much of it so quickly, you can easily waste 5 minutes just going through and selling and dismantling all the pointless gear you don't need. There's not even a multi-select feature so you can sell things quicker. Come on, Ubisoft, this isn't exactly my idea of a fun time. And a lot of the gear are copies of each other, but different rarities with different little stats. So again, a large bulk of the gear feels like bloat for the sake of bloat. Had Odyssey toned down the amount of gear and focused more on making each piece of gear different, rather than reusing some of the same gear but with a different color rarity associated with it, it would have been easier to digest. This is something Origins already nailed quite well. But Odyssey seems to take the more is better approach with a lot of the game's different elements, from world size, side content, gear, to even the story, which after a pretty strong opening act, there was still some weird goofiness in this game's opening, as I touched on earlier, but all in all, it was engaging, and it sets you up with a clear and simple goal going forward. Find Nikolaos and get some answers. But Odyssey's second act is where some of the narrative issues start to rear their ugly head. The pacing of the main plot slows down significantly once you leave Kephallonia. After you reunite with Nikolaos, he tells you he's not the father.
You are not!
You can decide whether to kill or spare him, and then you set out to get some answers from Elpenor, who turns out to be a member of the Cult of Cosmos, and after killing him and using his mask to infiltrate the cult's hideout, we're introduced to the game's primary antagonist, Deimos, the younger sibling of the Eagle Bearer, and Deimos will be either Alexios or Cassandra, depending on whom you chose to play as. Alexios technically being the canon version of Deimos. Michael Antonakos got quite a lot of flack for his performance in this game, but most of that to me is pretty unwarranted. I like his performance for the most part. There are some scenes that are delivered a bit awkwardly, but that definitely feels like more of a result of the dialogue than the performance. Some of the dialogue for Deimos is pretty bad, but the performance was about as good as it could be. After all, an actor can only do so much with the material they're given. And I like this initial introduction of Deimos' character. Not only is it one of the few good-looking motion-captured cutscenes in the game, but there's a certain gravitas to this scene. a strong way to introduce an antagonist in an intimidating way. However, Deimos as an antagonist in general is quite lacking. He was dropped off of Mount Taygetos as just a baby and survived. Marini tried to save him and get him medical attention, where she was told that he was dead, but in reality, the cult had just kidnapped him to raise him as their own weapon. So Deimos was raised in some terrible conditions and trained to be this cult enforcer, so it's no surprise he ended up the way he did. However, Deimos is not actually in this game much at all. For the primary antagonist of a huge game like this, he should have had significantly more scenes. And with that limited screen time, they gave no real time to flesh him out, and he comes off as mostly one note. We understand that he presumably had a terrible childhood and felt abandoned by his own family, but beyond that, there's not a whole lot of substance to this character. And when the entire plot is about trying to reunite the family and rescue Deimos to bring him back to the light, he needed to be in the game more and give the player more reason to actually care about and want to save him. That's something that just didn't work about Deimos. I didn't really care about him. Sure, I would have liked to save him, because that just feels like what the game wants you to do, but beyond that, I didn't feel a connection to this character. I didn't feel the same disparity that Cassandra and Marini felt in trying to bring him back to the light. So that paired with some very stereotypical generic villain dialogue, not a whole lot of screen time, and Deimos just doesn't feel like a compelling enough antagonist. If you want to look at an example within this series where this kind of antagonist and plot is executed much better, look at Assassin's Creed 3 with Haytham. Sure, the circumstances aren't exactly the same, but that story did a much better job of making me care about Haytham, making me want to save him. I understood why Connor wanted to try and have his father see the things the way he does, which makes it even more tragic when he has to kill him. In the endings where Cassandra is forced to kill Deimos, I don't feel that same impact or emotion. I feel it on Cassandra's part, in large part because of an excellent performance by Melisandre Mahout. I can see the pain she's going through having to kill her baby brother, but I don't feel that same emotion towards Deimos, because I never had the chance to even establish any kind of connection to that character. It just does not hit even close to as hard as AC3. But Deimos aside, another issue with Odyssey's main story is how slow it gets during the mid-game. You spend a large majority of Odyssey's second act searching for Marini, and it really drags this out. You'll be going to all sorts of places, meeting new characters who may have an idea of where Marini is, but first you gotta do favors for them, then it turns out most of them don't actually know where she is, but they might know someone who does, and you repeat the cycle for too long, where it feels like you're just making no real significant progression in the story. I get that finding Marini shouldn't be easy, and it should feel earned when you finally get to that reunion, which it does. I mean, how could it not after taking so long to find her? But so much of that portion of the game still feels padded out with filler, like a wild goose chase that exists for the purpose of inflating the runtime. And hey, to be fair, this is actually very similar to the Witcher 3 structure, where a huge majority of that second act is about finding Ciri, where the game's pacing can get very slow. Although, granted, the storylines and things you're doing in the meantime are super well written. But there's just a lot of unnecessary filler in Odyssey that I could have done without, and maybe that time might have been better spent giving your main antagonist more screen time. When you finally do reach Marini, things start to pick back up a bit more, and she tells Cassandra where she can find her biological father, bringing us to the lost city of Atlantis. The main plot is broken up into 3 separate arcs, the first being the Odyssey, probably the most important one about reuniting the family, and the other 2 being the Atlantis and Cult of Cosmos arcs. The Atlantis arc is where most of Odyssey's modern-day storyline takes place. Cassandra learns that Pythagoras is her biological father because he and Marini needed to continue the Izu lineage. Yeah, that puts a weird image in my head I'd rather not think about. But Cassandra and Pythagoras are tasked with sealing Atlantis by one of the Izu, Alethea, so that it can only be accessed by the Heir of Memories when the time is right. But the modern day up until this point has been very, very minimal. After the opening, you kind of forget it exists until you're suddenly pulled back out like 20 to 30 hours later. There's very little actual gameplay in the modern day. It's mostly some very light exploration with Layla, There's no combat or stealth missions, which doesn't automatically make it bad. We've seen this pulled off very well in the original Assassin's Creed, but Odyssey is lacking the mystery, intrigue, and storytelling to keep that interesting. A lot of the modern day story is just dumping you with exposition, either from emails or voice recordings from Alethea. Coming off of Origins, Layla didn't have a lot of characterization. We knew very little about her, aside from her past as an Abstergo employee and trying to prove her worth, but she didn't have much of an arc or any kind of substance to her character. But I was at least interested in having a third-person voiced modern-day protagonist again that we would get several games to explore. After all, Desmond in the first Assassin's Creed didn't have a whole lot of characterization either. He felt more like a bit of a blank slate for the player to inhabit, as we were just as confused and curious as to what was going on as he was, which worked very well in that game. But going into the Ezio games in AC3, we started to learn a bit more about him, see him develop dynamics with other characters, and more of his backstory. It wasn't a lot, but it was something. So heading into Odyssey, I was hoping Layla would get more depth, maybe learn more about her and some of her bigger motivations. But that doesn't happen. She again feels very one-dimensional. I'd speak on her personality, but that would be implying she had one. Furthermore, what makes her so special to be this heir of memories? Why her? Because she's the protagonist? Desmond, we at least understood, was the chosen one because of his ancestors and DNA. That's what made him such a valuable asset to the Assassins and Abstergo. Layla, on the other hand, feels like she's this chosen one out of pure plot convenience. But after collecting artifacts from Greek myths around the world, Pythagoras gives Cassandra the staff of Hermes that keeps whoever is in contact with it alive well past any normal human lifespan. It essentially makes them immortal. When Pythagoras hands it to Cassandra, he dies, and she holds on to it for 24 centuries before giving it to Layla and dying herself. What was she doing in those 2400 years? Crossovers and stuff, I guess. But Layla, now armed with the staff, must open the seal to Atlantis, and needs to know the proper order of symbols to do so. So you go to these different tombs around Greece to explore and find the proper symbols and their order. This is probably the most interesting thing you do gameplay-wise in the modern day. But once Layla returns and opens the seal, that's where the modern day in the base game ends, just on a very anticlimactic cliffhanger to be resolved in the Fate of Atlantis DLC, which I'll talk about in a separate video, but the modern day in this game is so limited, what is there isn't particularly well done, and they don't even resolve it in the main story. I'm one of the people who believe modern day is essential to this franchise. It's part of what makes the premise and narrative of Assassin's Creed so interesting and unique, but through playing these games, it is so obvious that Ubisoft really did not know what to do with it after Desmond. And while Origins at least set up a foundation for an interesting premise going forward, Odyssey's modern day does not capitalize on that as well as it could. It's given very little time to even tell a story to begin with. I mean, it doesn't even get enough time to get any sort of conclusion in the base game. It almost feels tacked on. And there's never been an instance in Assassin's Creed where the modern day just ends with no real ending and goes, "Wanna know what happens next? Go buy the DLC." Luckily, the other arcs at least have an ending. For the Cult of Cosmos, you're given this entire tab of cult members for you to investigate and kill. And once you've killed all of them, you can unveil the identity of the leader, the Ghost of Cosmos, and destroy them for good. This is entirely separate from the main plot once it's introduced, and you can progress it at your own pace. It doesn't even matter if you finish it before the other arcs or not, it's kind of in a vacuum. The objective is very simple, and there's not really much of a story to it aside from the final cutscene, but the bulk of this arc is just finding and killing all the cultists. Some cultists you'll need to find clues in order to unveil, some will require you to do a side quest to find and kill them, some will just bump into you in the open world by pure coincidence. I do like the freedom it gives you to investigate, find, and hunt each of these cultists. Having this hit list of targets feels like it fits well within an Assassin's Creed game, and it gives you this big mystery and web to unravel as to the leader's identity. When every cultist is finally killed, you go to their base of operations, where Cassandra touches an Izu artifact, and Pythagoras tells her through some weird vision that for some reason shows the other game's cinematic trailers that by destroying the cult, she has brought an end to chaos, but this will create an unbalance between order and chaos, alluding to the fact that the assassins will bring balance by fighting against order and control for freedom. It's then revealed that Aspasia is the ghost of Cosmos, but we all still know who's really behind all this. This reveal is lightly foreshadowed throughout the game. There's a moment where Aspasia is desperately trying to warn Marini of the danger of the cult of Cosmos, which makes a lot more sense in hindsight, knowing she had lost control of the cult and she knew what they were capable of. I remember the reveal surprising me when I first played Odyssey. She goes on to explain how the cult had lost their way and she lost control over them. It's a little strange to build up to this big final cultist only for her not to have condoned any of what the cult was actually doing. Either that or she's just trying to manipulate Cassandra, which is probably actually the case, as it's stated that the ghost of Cosmos is a liar in the clues you get. She also employs Phoebe and then kind of sends her to her death, which in hindsight does not seem like an accident. I hope that's what they were actually going for with her character, because that would make her a significantly more interesting and devious antagonist. If she really just did lose control of the cult, that's kind of lame. For some reason, the game lets you romance her here, which feels entirely inappropriate and out of nowhere considering the circumstances, but the game lets you either romance Aspasia, let her go, or kill her. Regardless of what you choose though, the cult of Cosmos is destroyed for good, and you can take them out before even finishing the main story with Deimos, which feels a bit strange, because then when you do those final quests in the Odyssey, the destruction of the cult is not talked about at all, and Deimos is a high-ranking member of the cult, and you're trying to convince him that they're manipulating and using him, so you'd think the fact that the cult is already destroyed would be brought up, but that's what happens when you have this open mission structure where you let the player complete the arcs in whatever order they want. It can create a disjointed feeling in the story. But with Atlantis dealt with and the cult destroyed, all that's left to do is deal with Deimos. Of the entire main story, the final act is definitely the best part, as things finally pick back up again after a very slow mid-game, and you get some much higher quality scenes in both visuals and performance. The climax comes when aiding Brasidas and the Spartans in battle against Deimos and the Athenians. After a couple trees put an end to Deimos and Cassandra's duel, she's captured and interrogated by him. The only way to reach the ending where Deimos has a change of heart and returns to the family is to be nice to him through initial encounters, and then convince him in this moment that the cult is just using him. It can be quite hard to do this, especially on a first blind playthrough, which I believe is the intent. He's lived in the darkness and been raised as a monster for so long that it shouldn't be easy to suddenly change his mind and have him stop being evil. Deimos is then joined by Cleon, the new leader of Athens, and this part really bothered me. Cleon wants Cassandra dead, so what does he do? He sends 2 unarmed guards into her cell to kill her, and then walks away. This level of incompetence is unbelievable. I understand the plot requires Cassandra to escape, but there's plenty of other ways to do this without making Cleon, someone who was established to be smart and cunning, look like an absolute buffoon. But after the easiest prison break of all time, and turning the people of Athens against Cleon, Cassandra once again sets off to help Brasidas take him down once and for all. This is probably my favorite sequence of the entire game. Not only is this scene with Deimos badass with some really awesome choreography, but Brasidas' death is absolutely brutal. It invokes shock value seeing a character that you liked and was so friendly be taken out in such a gruesome and unceremonious manner in the heat of battle. No plot armor to save him. It lends more fuel to the battle between Cassandra and Deimos. The confrontation is interrupted courtesy of a terrible shot by Cleon. Cassandra then kills him and heads back home to Sparta to meet with Marini, bringing us back to where the story all began on Mount Taygetos, and waiting for them is Deimos. Now, how Deimos managed to recover so quickly and know that Cassandra and Marini were going to the mountain at this particular moment, I'm not sure. I'd like to think he was just standing there dramatically with his back turned for days. But these final choices towards Deimos can severely impact the type of ending you get. There are 9 different possible variations you can get for the game's ending, depending on if you spared or killed Nikolaos, Stentor, got through or not to Deimos, and if you didn't, killing him before he can kill Marini. Many consider the best ending as the one where everyone in the family survives, and you bring Deimos home and live happily ever after. But the happiest ending doesn't necessarily mean the best ending and the one that makes the most sense for the story. And there is a certain poetic tragedy to the quote-unquote bad endings. Cassandra lost everything and was left all alone on that mountain to start the story, and for her to lose all her family on that mountain yet again, it's incredibly sad but a big full circle ending. To be forced to accept that any chance of saving her brother was long gone and that he'd been brainwashed by the cult for his entire life, or that Marini dies at the hand of the child she was so desperate to save and redeem herself for. Those make for some powerful and emotionally charged endings that I felt were more climactic and impactful than saving everyone and having a complete family dinner. In the ending where you do manage to undo Deimos' brainwashing, it doesn't feel quite right. It doesn't feel like only a couple conversations with the right choices would be enough to undo a lifetime of brainwashing, suffering, and hatred towards his family. You also don't get any type of final boss fight, so it feels rather anticlimactic. There is technically a canon ending as explored in the Assassin's Creed Odyssey novel that was released alongside the game, being where Nikolaos, Stentor, and Marini all live, while Deimos being the only casualty, as Cassandra is forced to kill him. Regardless though, the choices towards the family members in the end do end up mattering, which is what you want out of a large, branching RPG story like this. But after the family dinner, you say your goodbyes to Herodotus and Barnabas. Wait, the guy who voiced Barnabas also voiced Cesare Borgia, Otto Berg, Israel Putnam, and Francesco de Pazzi? Okay, new favorite character. As I said goodbye to these characters though, and the Odyssey came to an end, I felt a strange kind of emptiness. The journey was over, and had basically been my full-time job for 2 months, so it felt weird. I just felt empty, that it was all over.
I did as I was asked.
No, you did as you pleased. Malik has told me of the arrogance you displayed, your disregard for our ways.
What are you doing?
There are rules. We are nothing if we do not abide by the Assassin's creed. 3 simple tenets, which you seem to forget. I will remind you. First and foremost, stay your blade.
From the flesh of an innocent. I know.
And stay your tongue. The second tenet is that which gives us strength. Hide in plain sight. Let the people mask you such that you become one with the crowd. You remember? The third and final tenet. The worst of all your betrayals. Never compromise the brotherhood.
You know what? Fuck you! Naka!
As I reflect on my recent experience with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, I find myself with very conflicting feelings. Maybe the most conflicted I have ever felt about any video game I've ever played, because I'm tempted to say I enjoyed myself. Living in and exploring ancient Greece was genuinely a blast. I felt like I lived through my own very, very long adventure. Somehow the worlds of Assassin's Creed, no matter when or where they are, always seem to reel me in. Some of the quests and moments I experienced were very memorable, but I still found myself experiencing some of the issues I initially had with the game 6 years ago. It's hard to sail these seas and ride through these biomes without thinking about how much of a departure this is from the Assassin's Creed I love. How much of the soul of what made this series what it was is absent. And for that reason, I can't bring myself to love this game. But I can see and appreciate the positives that I was blind to in the past, and why so many people do love it. It's such an infuriating game for me to think about because it's just like I said, it's just conflicting. If you asked me to rank the games, which people have been for ages now, I'll probably do it after Shadows comes out. Probably. I'd put Odyssey near the bottom of the ranking, and not because I believe it's a bad game. Like I said, for the most part, I had fun. Wow, I never thought I would be saying that about this game, but here we are. But when I stack it up to the rest of the series, it's just not what I personally wanted from Assassin's Creed. So really, I guess what I've been trying to say, and maybe what I should have said instead of making this behemoth of a video is, good game, bad Assassin. Hey everybody, if you're still watching and actually watched through this whole thing, well, first of all, thank you. This was probably the most mentally exhausting and draining video I have ever made. If you watch my videos a lot, you probably noticed I didn't upload anything for over a month, which is the longest I've ever gone without uploading since starting my channel 5 years ago, and that's because I was determined to finish this before doing anything else. This is the first time on my channel I've made a full critique and retrospective of Odyssey. Yeah, I've talked about it in similar videos here and there, but nothing to this length and detail, not even close. It's a video I've wanted to make for a long time, and if I'm being honest, I meant to do it much sooner, but now that I finally was doing it, I wanted to give it my full, undivided attention because it's a really important one to me. Like I said, I've had a really weird journey with this game myself. However, I didn't intend for the video to take me this long to make. I thought it would be done initially before even the end of August, and it ended up taking me a whole other month. At the start, I was having some technical issues with my PC. Long story short, I had to end up getting a new GPU. That hindered my progress a bit. Then I just got really caught up in my own head and overthinking while making this. My anxiety got really intense. I found myself being way more of a perfectionist than I usually am, which I guess is the result of this feeling like such an important video to me. The video also turned out to be bigger than I was even expecting, so that probably contributed to how much work it actually ended up being. But now that it's done, and I'm happy with the end result, I'm feeling much better. But I wanted to let you guys know why it was taking so long, so I appreciate your patience. I was gonna try and do Assassin's Creed Valhalla immediately after this like a psychopath, so I could have them both fresh on my mind before Shadows comes out, but I need a break from these RPG games, it's too much. Shadows getting delayed is actually like a blessing in disguise for me. It just gives me more time to make the videos I want to make before that comes out. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you for all the support as always, and thank you once again to War Thunder for sponsoring the video. I started a Patreon in my little hiatus as well, where I'm doing exclusive content and early access to my videos and more things like that. I offer the same for my YouTube membership as well. If you're interested in getting some perks and supporting the channel while you're at it, I'd appreciate it. The links are in the description. Not forcing anyone, obviously. I appreciate you guys just watching my videos. I still have to pinch myself now and then when I realize I'm actually doing my dream job. But again, thank you guys. Love you all. I'm gonna need a solid 5-year break before I'm ready to talk about Odyssey again. So peace out. Have a good day.